So, I have spent most of my professional career very solidly in the camp of if I'm going to shoot video, I'm going to use a video camera. But at this point, not even I can fight it. So here it is, friends. I am Dr. Awesome, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you need to know to start shooting video with a DSLR. So here on the desk, I've got sort of a variety of cameras, and they all have one thing in common. These are the digital evolution of the sort of standard stills camera that have all been adapted to record video. And cameras like this have become really, really popular with cinematographers and filmmakers for a variety of reasons. They're smaller and compact, the different lenses, they're more versatile in that they take both stills and video. But really, the biggest thing people talk about is that the way these cameras shoot is inherently more cinematic. And there's a lot that goes into that, but really the biggest thing is that these cameras offer a higher level of manual control. And so those settings is kind of what we're going to talk about as part of this video. First things first, white balance your camera, okay? Proper white balance is the difference between this and this. This is gross. Nobody wants to watch footage like this. And while a lot can be fixed in post, if your white balance is way off, you're going to have just a nightmare of a time in color correction and color grading. Let's get rid of this. Now, while manual white balance is always the best choice, with DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, that can get to be kind of a tedious process. The good news is that with all these cameras, most of their sort of preset white balances are actually really, really accurate and very, very usable. So just make sure that if you're shooting outside, you got the camera set to daylight. If you're shooting inside, you got the camera set to fluorescent or incandescent, depending on the room you're in. I would also recommend that if you're shooting indoor with LED light, setting it to incandescent. And if you're shooting in a studio like this, set it to halogen. And if you do that, you'll probably, honestly, be okay. Just make sure to adjust depending on where you're at, okay? Along with your white balance, when you're trying to figure out color for your camera, another piece of that puzzle is, or are, picture profiles. What picture profiles are is the in-camera color science that sort of tells it how to record colors. Most DSLRs are going to come with some standard options of landscape, portrait, vivid, and neutral or flat. When it comes to both photography and videography, I always recommend using the neutral or flat profiles. And what's going to happen when you actually use that is, in camera, your footage is going to look a little desaturated, maybe a little less sharp, and it's going to look just a little off, like this. Now, here's what you're actually doing. You're not really degrading the quality of your footage. What you're actually doing is increasing your camera's dynamic range, which is the distance between overexposed and underexposed. And by doing this, you're really giving your camera more to work with in that area. And unlike light, color and contrast can always be added back in post. The next thing we're going to talk about is the importance of choosing the correct frame rate. Now, these cameras, well, really any camera, is incapable of actually recording motion. What cameras do is record a series of still images that, when played back at a given rate, create the perception of motion. And your frame rate is the number of still images per second of footage that create that movement, that video. Most DSLRs are going to come with standard frame rates of 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. Some of them are going to come with options of 120 or maybe even 300 frames per second. Other cameras, other like crazy cameras, are going to have even higher frame rates than that, but those aren't the cameras we're talking about here. If we're talking about 300 or 120 frames per second, those are pretty much exclusively used for slow motion. And by slow motion, what I mean is in post-editing, what you'll do is you'll slow that footage down. And the reason you use higher frame rates for slow motion is because the more frames there are, the easier it is to slow it down without it getting degraded and looking like, bad stop motion. 60 frames a second is sort of the sort of the entry-level slow motion, but it is occasionally used for other things like sports and action shots, things like that, things where you want to have a lot of very smooth motion. 30 frames per second is now and always has been the standard for television broadcast. If you're ever going to record something to put it on TV or in a TV studio, make sure you're recording at 30 frames per second. Otherwise, what will happen is your audio will be off and your video will be funky. 24 frames a second, which is what this video is being shot in, is sort of the cinematic standard. This is what's used for movies. And there's a lot of things that go into sort of 24 frames a second having prevalence for so long in the cinema industry. People talk about it being the most natural or most comfortable, but really what I think the answer is, when you really get down to it, is it's the easiest to light. Of course, saying that 24 frames a second is the easiest frame rate to light does beg the question of why, and that brings us to shutter speed. Shutter speed is important for two reasons. One, it's your camera's primary method of lighting control. The longer that shutter is open, the more light's coming in. The shorter the time that shutter's open, the less light's coming in. But it's also how the camera interprets movement or motion. And what I mean by that is when you're looking at something in real life, you don't see everything crystallinely clear. There's motion blur and things like that. And our shutter speed is how we establish how much motion blur exists within a shot. And sort of to get the most true-to-life motion blur, what you're looking for is what we call the double shutter rule. And what that means is that you want your shutter speed to be double that of your frame rate. And so if we're shooting at 24 frames a second, you want it to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/48th of a second for your shutter speed. Now, most cameras aren't going to give you the option of 1/48th. They'll give you 1/50th, which is just fine. And so that's a pretty long time for your shutter to be open, as compared to 60 frames a second, where now it needs to be open for less than 1/120th of a second, right? And so things get a little more complicated as you go up in frame rate if you're trying to keep that natural life motion blur, because there's less light coming into your camera. Now, like all rules, the double shutter rule is one that can be broken depending on what you're trying to do. If you have a very long shutter speed, what can happen is you can get very dreamlike, very floaty, sort of fuzzy, crazy footage. And if you have a very high shutter speed, as long as you're properly exposed, you get very intense, very fast motion, very just like crazy stuff. You just have to know what it is you're looking for. While shutter speed is what I would call the primary method of lighting control, it's certainly not the only method. Let's talk about f-stop. If you're used to using a camcorder-style camera, f-stop is probably what you referred to as the iris function. Basically, the lower your f-stop, the more open that iris, the more light is coming in. The higher your f-stop, the more closed that iris, the less light is coming in. But it does something else as well. Your f-stop helps control your depth of field. Now, depth of field is the distance between the closest and farthest things in a given shot that can be considered to be in focus. And depending on where your f-stop is at, it's going to change that depth of field. The lower f-stops are going to produce shallower depths of field. The higher f-stops are going to create deeper depths of field. And this is really what separates these kind of cameras from camcorders, is this variable depth of field, the control that you have over how shallow or deep those shots really are. Another piece of the proper exposure puzzle is ISO. I'd love to tell you what ISO stands for, but we don't have that kind of time. But here's what it does, okay? ISO is how sensitive your camera is to the light that's coming in through the lens. Now, it doesn't let any more or less light in per se, but it does tell the camera how to interpret that information. The lower your ISO, the less sensitive your camera is. The higher your ISO, the more sensitive your camera is. This is just like gain with a traditional camcorder. There's a lot more fine-tuning options with a DSLR than there is with most other cameras, though. Here's the thing, though. Just like a traditional camcorder, the higher that number, because there's not actually any more light coming in, this is going to increase your chance for getting grain and garbage footage. So try and keep it as low as you possibly can, but know that it's a tool that's there for you to use. Of course, visuals aren't the only thing that go into a good video project, right? We need to talk about audio real quick. Here's the thing about audio, and it's something that people get wrong a lot. Audio is important. It's not something that you can tag on or try and wing. You really have to think about it from the beginning and really make decisions that are going to give you the best product from the start. And in most cases with a DSLR, what that means is utilizing an external mic. It can be a lav mic or a boom mic, and then running that mic into some kind of external recorder, be it something like this thing here or another camera or something, because the preamps that exist in these cameras are great. One of the things you have to remember is that at the end of the day, these cameras are still made for photography and have been adapted to take video. And a good preamp, one with enough oomph to really handle a good sound quality, is not something that there's space for in this little body. So I'm not saying you can't use a microphone and run it directly into the camera, but just remember that you're going to be happier and it's going to be better if you use some kind of secondary recorder. And that, friends, is pretty much the basics on the things you need to understand to shoot video with a DSLR or mirrorless style camera. If you've been shooting video with any kind of camera, none of this is new. These are all things you've been doing before, but when you move to a camera like one of these, it's really important to have an understanding of these settings and what they do, because if you try and pull it out and just wing it, you're never going to get the footage that you're actually looking for, and you're going to completely waste the potential of the gear. Unfortunately, there are no shortcuts. The only way to really get good at any of this is to take a camera out and start practicing and get a feel for it. So that's what you got to do. And with that, I'm done. Keep shooting, friends.